The Biden administration approving another $800 million in Ukrainian military aid. This came after an impassioned plea from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to members of Congress yesterday, saying that if the United States is unwilling to implement a no-fly zone, there is still more that it can be doing to assist. This comes as talks between Russia and Ukraine continue today. Let's get over to NBC's Molly Hunter in Lviv as Russia continues its assault. Molly, hearing these talks about potential peace talks, at the same time watching some of these images where, as you showed us in the last hour, theaters where children were sheltering, and it was very clearly marked. That is kind of hard to get your head around.
That's exactly right. So while the Russian troops are bombing places they know for a fact civilians are either sheltering or evacuating, where people are sleeping in their apartments at home in Kyiv, peace talks are trying to make some progress. And of course, for the Ukrainians, priority number one is a ceasefire. That comes as President Zelensky is making the rounds. Of course, as we talked about earlier this week, he spoke with the Canadian Parliament. He spoke to Congress yesterday. Today, he spoke with the German Parliament. A very different message to the Germans today, really scathing and really making a direct plea to German Chancellor Scholz to be the leader that Germans deserve. But we actually have an update, Becky, on that theater that you just mentioned that we told you about last hour. We just got a statement from a Ukrainian member of parliament, Dmitry Gurin, and he says the rescue operation is ongoing. We can confirm that the bomb shelter under the theater withstood the attack, and people are still being evacuated at this moment. There is no information yet on injuries, deaths, and other numbers. The shelter held mainly women and children. So our understanding before we got that statement was that about 1,200 people were sheltering at this theater, as you say, clearly marked, that said children. From above, we've seen the satellite photos. Anyone from above would have seen in the Russian language the demarcation of children. They knew that civilians were there. We have not received a death toll, but it is good news that people are being evacuated, of course. The other thing we are expecting today, 9 different humanitarian corridors are currently being negotiated, one of which is out of Mariupol. And as we have said, so far, the only way out for civilians has been on private vehicles. Well, there are buses waiting to go in to pick up women, to pick up children, to pick up anyone who hasn't been able to get on one of those vehicles if a temporary ceasefire is agreed in that area. So far, though, no signs that is happening.
Molly, these acts are so atrocious and so in your face, and it's hard not to talk about that. You understand entirely why President Biden would turn around yesterday and say, yes, I think Putin is a war criminal. At least that's his opinion on things as we continue to watch the investigation and see what happens with some of these things. It's what all of us think, what all of us feel, and at the same time, you can understand the idea that the rhetoric, the raising of the rhetoric, makes it all the more difficult for peace talks to continue when, the Kremlin is putting out this ridiculous idea that they take affront at Putin being called a war criminal. Like, the name-calling is the worst that's happening here. But you do understand that all of that rhetoric does not make it easier to try and bring a resolution.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure that rhetoric, that ramped-up U.S.-Russia rhetoric, helps the Ukrainians at the negotiating table. And we heard from President Zelensky just a couple of days ago, who said he didn't think the U.S. was involved enough. He didn't think the West was involved enough. He didn't think they were kind of taking his side like he needed them to. Yesterday, the word that we got out of the peace talks was that President Zelensky said they were starting to look more realistic. Russian foreign minister said they might be nearing a draft with some concessions, and they've been talking a lot about the compromises that might be made around Kyiv with a neutral status. Nothing from either side yet about whether or not those have progressed. And I think as blatant and brutal civilian attacks continue, like we have seen, Becky, I think it's going to be harder and harder to make progress at the table.
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC on YouTube.